Video games can span so many different genres and formats and, of course, difficulty levels, and if you've been a fan of video games for a long time, you'll know that some games out there are definitely harder than others. Some games are such challenges that most players don't end up completing the game or take hundreds of hours just to learn the game and beat it. You might be wondering why some people are willing to put themselves through that sort of thing, but you're talking to a fan of Souls-likes, so I'm not really the right person to question this. Still, today I decided to take a look at 13 of the hardest video games ever released. So without further ado, let's just dive right into the video. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is a bit of a different spin on Souls-like gameplay from Software, but it's still a brutal game nonetheless. It's a bit more forgiving on some things than Dark Souls, with grappling hooks and things like stealth opportunities being easier, but make no mistake, Sekiro is a rough game at times. Sekiro is quite different compared to Dark Souls because the gameplay doesn't rely specifically on dodging and rolling, rather Sekiro relies heavily on parrying attacks, but some attacks can be super fast, brutal, and punishing, meaning you need to time your parries really well in Sekiro. You're not supposed to parry only in Sekiro, but most of the time gameplay relies on parrying at just the right moment, but there's jumps and dodges for sure. Sekiro also demands that you get the gameplay right because it can be very punishing if you don't understand how the combat mechanics work in the game. Once you figure out how Sekiro plays, it becomes much smoother, but until you figure it out, it can be a bit of a long road. Ninja Gaiden originally released for the Nintendo Entertainment System way back in the days of retro games and has been remade for modern systems since. Still, Ninja Gaiden has long been a difficult game for a multitude of reasons. Ninja Gaiden may not have particularly difficult enemies when they operate on an individual basis, but when they are all jumping at you at once, yes, this game can get insanely tough to deal with. The original Ninja Gaiden on the NES was definitely a complicated game that required strict timing with very specific actions done in certain orders for a player to win. Additionally, bosses often didn't get close by checkpoints, which is something that can be complicated to handle if you lose to a boss a lot. The newer 3D ones are pretty difficult as well, with aggressive enemies and bosses that can dodge and have tons of health. The enemy waves you deal with can be very intensive, and there isn't much room for taking breaks in this game. But still, whatever iteration of Ninja Gaiden you're playing, it definitely is a very fun and intense game, just difficult. Cuphead is honestly a pretty tough game, sometimes even brutally tough in those boss fights. I mean, look, I love difficult games, but Cuphead really does take the cake for how frustratingly difficult this game can feel. There's quite a few mechanics you need to learn, but beyond that, the game sends you into levels that are, in retrospect, not very long, but dying in those levels is very easy. Not only that, but some of the boss fights are absolutely wild, and even more than that, dying at any point in a level sends you all the way back to the beginning of that level. At least it's not like roguelike games though, where you just restart the entire game. Still, Cuphead, for those who aren't used to it, can be brutally difficult on the harder difficulties. It's not the most difficult game of all time, but definitely isn't the easiest game either. The run and gun missions can be hard due to the speed that the game throws enemies at you with, but the boss fights are really where the difficulty ramps up fast. Cuphead is also pretty unforgiving when it comes to making mistakes, so you really need to keep your guard up and watch for those enemies. I asked myself which Dark Souls I wanted to include on this list because, to be honest, if I wanted to include every From Software game, we'd be here for a while. Still, I figured, you know what, we'll just loop all 3 Dark Souls games into one here because technically it really depends on which one you start with. Dark Souls may not be the first Souls game with Demon Souls taking that title, but Dark Souls really improved on the formula presented in Demon Souls and spawned one of the craziest but honestly most amazing series in video game history. Dark Souls is built off of throwing at you the hardest bosses right from the onset, with you needing to learn a ton from your own mistakes in order to beat the game and understand how bosses operate. Dying several times to bosses is a bit too commonplace in Dark Souls, but when you beat the bosses, it's a very accomplishing feeling. Dodging and rolling, as well as some level of parrying, are required to master in order to really finish Dark Souls, and you also need to learn how to distribute stats, because that's super important. Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 are all relatively difficult games, but once you get used to the formula, you'll probably find them easier as you go, except maybe for Dark Souls 2, I feel like that game just hates you. Sifu is a fighting game classified as a beat-em-up, but it's got a very rough gameplay design that can be pretty challenging and brutal if you're not prepared. Combat is pretty difficult as is in Sifu, but that's not really the only caveat in this game. When you die, you're resurrected, but there's a catch: you age up. Sure, you access more powerful attacks, but you have reduced health, making the game even harder. At some point, you've become so old, you'll basically just die. In that case, you need to restart the level from the beginning, from the same age as your first attempt in that particular level. Combat in this game relies on you understanding the combinations, blocking, and timing. What's neat though is that you're not just fighting head-on the entire time, but you can also use things like your environment around you to your advantage, or even get certain dialogue options that let you avoid combat altogether. There are some forgiving elements to this game, but the aging up system is definitely not one of those forgiving elements. Sifu is definitely a challenging game, but once you get the hang of it, it definitely starts to click better. Returnal is a roguelike third-person shooter title that basically deals in a time loop sort of system. So every time you die, you don't reset from a checkpoint, instead you reset from basically the very beginning of the game, though the game is split into two parts, so if you're in part 2, you don't reset from part 1. This makes it obviously very difficult for obvious reasons. Making mistakes can be very costly and can also get frustrating if you just keep dying over and over and over. The nice thing about Returnal is that eventually you will improve and you will get better at the game, but there is a learning curve to understanding how exactly this game is supposed to be played. Of course, eventually it'll click, but until then you're going to be dealing with insane bullet storms of enemies. Still, at some point you sort of get into a groove with the gameplay and understanding the mechanics, but it can definitely feel unforgiving at times with fast-paced enemies, intensive combat, and just getting swarmed by everything constantly around you. Platformers are notoriously difficult for many reasons, and Super Meat Boy is honestly no exception, as the game has the requirement for split-second timing, and the controls are pretty fine and detailed. You basically have to play through 300 levels that are full of obstacles and more, but you need to be non-stop paying attention as you're playing because this game throws everything at you. Now, for people who often play platformers, Super Meat Boy probably won't be the hardest game you've ever played, but in a way, it's still not an easy platformer, especially for people who like to 100% complete games or collect trophies or both. Either way though, Super Meat Boy is a pretty difficult platformer, especially when you get to the Dark World levels. Still, the game is super fun and it's very rewarding to complete when you do, plus the levels themselves are relatively small, so you will get variety as you keep playing. Platformers again are on the list, but what can I say, platformers are definitely not the easiest genre out there. But not only platformers, platforming Metroidvania roguelikes are where the difficulty starts to ramp up quite a bit. Dead Cells is no exception to this. Dead Cells is one of my favorite games ever made, but I won't lie and say that it's an easy game, because Dead Cells punishes you pretty badly for death. Dead Cells requires you to understand the high-speed action going on around you because this game will constantly pelt you with new enemies and flying enemies and whatever else it comes up with. And not only that, some enemies can dodge your attacks, some can slam hammers on you and destroy half your health, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, if you die, you don't just restart the level or the area that you're in. No. You reset the entire game. You lose all the weapons you found, all your cells, and you have to rerun everything. And it is punishing, but it's honestly so much fun. Dead Cells is tough, but I will say that eventually it does click and you get into a pretty good groove with the game. You just have to be fast with your reaction time. I'm gonna have to hit you with another platformer, but trust me when I say that this one isn't an easy one either. Celeste may start out straightforward and nice, but as you progress in the world, it becomes a pretty brutal challenge. Still, it's not the most difficult platformer, and it does help you learn the mechanics of the game as you go on, so you'll eventually sort of click with the game, but not after suffering for a bit. Celeste is challenging and it requires a lot of learning when it comes to how the game actually works when you play it. You need to time your jumps, focus on where you're going next, take advantage of the air dash mechanic, and more. It's not a roguelike platformer, so dying won't just reset you from the entire game, but you'll definitely reset certain levels and checkpoints many times, which can certainly cause frustration. It's not hard in that it punishes you like other games do, but it definitely has a learning curve to it. Nioh Nioh 2 is a great Team Ninja title that really improves upon the formula presented in Nioh 1, which is an absolutely amazing game as well. Nioh 2 hammers in a very high-speed level of combat with many elements to that combat system, but one thing that you tend to notice about the combat is that it's very high energy and very action-packed. Nioh 2 is a pretty difficult game because you have to learn the enemy moves, understand the right combinations to attack, and enemy difficulty ramps up quite a lot at some point, so the game doesn't just let you off easy. Gameplay in Nioh 2 also requires you to understand your positioning in a fight. Luckily though, at some point you get so used to the combat that it does become a little bit natural. Also, the more you build your character's strength, the more it's a doable game. Still, this is a difficult game, and it's pretty tough when it comes to punishing players for making combat mistakes. Nioh 2 has been considered a Souls-like by many, so maybe that helps make the picture clear. Lies of P is a Souls-like and a sort of Bloodborne-like in a way, but this game can get pretty brutal. Still, Lies of P can be a bit forgiving in some things once you've figured out a playstyle that works for you, but Lies of P does seem to put a heavier emphasis on parrying, with the perfect parry system being really what the game wants you to understand. Dodging isn't terrible, but it's definitely not the best reliable playstyle in this game, which is where I found the difficulty at first because I went into Lies of P thinking that it was basically just like Dark Souls. Additionally, your weapon in Lies of P deteriorates while you're fighting, and you'll need to repair it mid-fight. That pitches you front and center to bosses attacking you. On top of that, the further in the game you get, the more intense the boss fights get. The checkpoints are generous though, but there are some things like ridiculous platforming sections that really enraged me. There was a patch added to the game that did make it a little bit more palatable to play, but still, even with that patch, it's a very difficult game. However, once it clicks, Lies of P is not the hardest game. Well, minus the last couple of bosses. Still, it's a great game and a personal favorite of mine. A bit of an older title here on the list, but Ghosts and Goblins is a notoriously difficult game from 1985 that originally released to arcade systems, but would be ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System home consoles. Considered one of the best video games ever made, Ghosts and Goblins is considered a very difficult game as well. The levels are very challenging, you have limited lives, and the enemies can be pretty brutal. Being a platformer as well, there is a level of precision required in order to really get this game down. With platformers, I find the general challenge is not just in things like timing, but also precision, because one wrong move or one wrong jump and you're dead. It's certainly got a learning curve to it as well, but it's a pretty brutal game nonetheless. You only get a chance to be hit twice before you have to restart a level or a checkpoint. If you don't finish a level within a certain amount of time, you'll automatically lose a life. Also, if you really want to get the true ending of the game, after you've defeated the final boss, you're gonna have to replay the entire game on a harder difficulty, as if it wasn't already difficult enough. Geometry Dash is honestly a very difficult game, and I mean that. Geometry Dash is a game that basically sends you into level after level, but each level gets progressively more difficult and faster than its predecessor, meaning that you are not going to get a break anytime soon. The more you go in the game, the more brutal and almost insane the levels seem to become. The hardest levels of Geometry Dash are honestly on a whole other level compared to some of the other games on this list. While some of these games tend to feel forgiving at some point or provide you with tools to make the game a bit easier, Geometry Dash actually feels more unforgiving the further you move on. Timing is very precise in this game because one misclick or one slight mistake and you'll basically be sent back to the beginning of the level, which means that even if you were basically almost done, you've got to restart that particular level. It also doesn't help that the gameplay is super fast paced at some points, so messing up becomes much easier at some levels. Geometry Dash is honestly one of the hardest games out there, but if you like games with high-speed gameplay and precise timing, I think that this is a pretty good game for that. And with that being said, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed that video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe with notifications set to all so you never miss out on a single upload. Comment below what your thoughts are on some of these games on the list and which one is your favorite. Don't forget to check out our website for gaming news, entertainment, and more. The link to that, as well as all our other important links, are in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you all in the next one.